Linda Carson never thought buying a simple evening dress would turn into a battlefield of dignity and prejudice. It was a bright Saturday afternoon when 16-year-old Linda Carson stepped into Bella's boutique, her heart fluttering with excitement. For the first time, she was shopping alone without her father. Mark Carson, a respected businessman who owned several luxury stores across the state. Linda had always dreamed of browsing these designer racks by herself, imagining each dress as part of the confident woman she was becoming. Today felt like that special day. She walked in wearing her favorite denim jacket, her hair tied back neatly, and her eyes scanning every shimmering gown with anticipation for her father's upcoming charity gala. As she reached out to touch a deep sapphire dress that gleamed under the chandelier lights, Linda felt a surge of pride. This was her moment to choose how she presented herself to the world. But what she didn't see standing a few feet away near the perfume display was Margaret Pierce, a woman known among locals for her sharp tongue and sharper prejudices. As Linda admired the gown's silk lining, Margaret's eyes narrowed, her thin lips curling into a sneer. To Margaret, Linda's dark skin and youthful confidence didn't belong in this boutique's polished world. She clenched her purse tighter, her mind already scheming, unaware that her cruel assumptions were about to collide head-on with a truth she could never have imagined. Linda felt the satin fabric glide between her fingers, its softness whispering promises of elegance. She imagined herself arriving at her father's gala, the chandeliers reflecting off the dress as people turned to admire her. For a moment, she forgot about the world outside and its judgments. But that illusion shattered the second Margaret Pierce began moving closer. Margaret's heels clicked sharply against the boutique's marble floors, echoing with the authority she thought her status gave her. She kept her chin high as she approached her perfume, leaving a trail of expensive roses and cold disdain. Linda sensed a presence behind her and turned, startled, her eyes meeting Margaret's icy gaze. There was no greeting, no smile, only a simmering disgust that made Linda's stomach tighten. Margaret pretended to glance at the dresses before loudly saying to no one in particular, "They really let anyone in here these days, don't they?" The words hung heavy in the hushed boutique. Linda inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She had faced rude people before, but there was something deeper here, something uglier. She turned away, refusing to give Margaret the satisfaction of a reaction, and continued browsing. But Margaret was not finished. She followed Linda, her heels clacking deliberately like a judge's gavel. When Linda found a second gown, a pale lilac with delicate embroidery, she lifted it with a smile, thinking how her father would beam with pride seeing her wear it. But before she could carry it to the fitting room, Margaret stepped directly in her path. "You know," Margaret said, her voice dripping with condescension, "that dress costs more than some people's rent." "Are you sure you're in the right place, sweetheart?" Linda's throat burned with emotion, but she kept her voice calm. "I am exactly where I need to be," she replied softly but firmly, clutching the dress tighter. She tried to move past, but Margaret shifted, blocking her again. "Don't get smart with me," Margaret hissed, lowering her voice. "Girls like you should learn their place before embarrassing themselves." Linda's fingers trembled around the hanger as anger and shame twisted in her chest. She refused to cry. She refused to look away. Instead, she drew in a shaky breath, squared her shoulders, and met Margaret's stare. "My place is wherever I choose it to be," she said, her words quiet, but carrying a force that made Margaret blink with surprise. But before Margaret could reply, Linda walked away with measured grace, heading straight to the fitting room. As she slipped inside, she felt her heart racing like a drum in her chest. The dress felt heavier in her arms now, burdened with the tension of the encounter. She sat down on the small velvet bench, closed her eyes, and whispered to herself, "Don't let her win." Outside, Margaret's eyes narrowed further. Her pride was wounded, and in her mind, Linda's quiet dignity was defiance. She clenched her purse strap until her knuckles whitened. Margaret wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. In her world, people like Linda needed reminders of where they belonged. And as Linda changed into the dress, admiring her reflection with a flicker of regained joy, Margaret was already marching toward the manager, ready to unleash a storm that neither Linda nor the boutique staff saw coming. Margaret approached the boutique's front counter with purpose, her heels striking the marble like war drums. The young store manager, Sarah Mitchell, looked up with a polite smile that faltered the moment she saw Margaret's face tight with anger. "Mrs. Pierce." Sarah greeted nervously, tucking a stray blonde hair behind her ear. "Is there something I can help you with today?" Margaret scoffed lightly, leaning forward over the counter, lowering her voice just enough to create an air of urgency. "Yes, there is. I've been watching a girl in your store," she began, her tone dripping with feigned concern. "She's been acting suspiciously since she walked in. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if she slipped something into her purse by now." Sarah blinked in confusion. "Who are you referring to, ma'am?" Margaret rolled her eyes dramatically and gestured in the direction of the fitting rooms. "That girl. The one trying on dresses she clearly can't afford. I'd hate to see such a reputable boutique lose inventory because you were too afraid to do your job." Sarah swallowed hard, glancing nervously toward the fitting room hallway. The other sales associates paused their folding and steaming, subtly leaning closer to listen. They all knew Margaret Pierce by reputation. Wealthy, vindictive, and quick to call corporate over any slight. The thought of confronting a potential shoplifter terrified Sarah, but so did the idea of upsetting one of their most powerful regular customers. Margaret narrowed her eyes at Sarah's hesitation. "Well," she snapped, "are you just going to stand there while that girl steals from you, or will you handle this properly?" Sarah inhaled shakily and nodded. I'll check," she whispered, her heart thudding in her chest. She called over an older associate named Denise to watch the register while she walked toward the fitting rooms, her steps feeling heavier with each stride. Inside the small changing space, Linda stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the lilac dress with trembling hands. For a fleeting moment, she let herself imagine walking into the gala next to her father, the skirt flowing like soft waves at her ankles, her smile radiant beneath the chandelier lights. That moment shattered when a soft knock sounded at the door. Miss Sarah said, her voice gentle, but edged with discomfort. "I'm so sorry, but would you mind stepping out with your bag for a moment?" Linda frowned, confusion flickering across her features. Why, she asked, her voice quiet but steady. There's been a concern raised about potential theft," Sarah stammered, shame flushing her pale cheeks. "I'm so sorry. We have to check." Linda felt as though the ground beneath her feet was giving way. Her face burned hot with humiliation. "I haven't taken anything," she said firmly, fighting the trembling in her voice. Sarah bit her lip and nodded, eyes darting nervously toward the front where Margaret stood watching with folded arms and a triumphant smirk. Linda could feel the heat of Margaret's satisfaction even from across the store. With dignity still clinging to her like a fragile shawl, Linda stepped out of the fitting room, her purse clutched in her hand, her back straight. She handed it to Sarah without a word, her eyes glistening but unbroken. Around them, shoppers paused to watch, their whispers slicing through the boutique's quiet music like cold wind. As Sarah rifled through Linda's bag with shaking hands, finding nothing but a small wallet and a tube of lip balm, Linda exhaled slowly, her chest tightening with a sorrow so deep it felt like an anchor in her lungs. But Margaret only sniffed dismissively, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "Check again," she ordered, her voice echoing with arrogance and disdain. To her, Linda's innocence didn't matter. This wasn't about theft. It was about power and making sure the girl before her never forgot who supposedly belonged in a store like this and who didn't. Linda's fingers clenched into tight fists at her sides as Sarah rifled through her purse once more, her hands trembling with anxiety under Margaret's piercing stare. Shoppers nearby pretended to browse, but stole glances, their eyes darting between Linda and Margaret like spectators waiting for a verdict. The store's soft instrumental music now felt hauntingly hollow, underscoring Linda's growing humiliation. Sarah finally exhaled shakily, glancing at Margaret with pleading eyes. "Mrs. Pierce, there's nothing here," she said quietly, her voice almost apologetic for speaking the truth. But Margaret wasn't satisfied. She stepped forward, her expensive perfume invading Linda's senses, as she leaned in, eyes narrowed with icy contempt. "If you have nothing to hide," she sneered, her voice dripping with poisonous sweetness, "then why are you so defensive?" The words stung worse than an open slap. Linda lifted her chin, feeling her throat tighten with unshed tears. Defensive, she repeated softly, her voice trembling yet steady. "You're accusing me of stealing when all I did was walk into this store to buy a dress. That's not being defensive. That's self-respect." A tense silence spread across the boutique. Even Sarah paused, her gaze flickering between Linda's trembling form and Margaret's rigid posture. For a brief moment, guilt flashed across Sarah's face, but Margaret's scowl erased it just as quickly. "Enough of this nonsense," Margaret snapped, turning to Sarah with a final tone of authority. "Get the manager to escort her out. We don't need troublemakers like her ruining this store's reputation." Sarah hesitated, biting her lip until it turned pale. She didn't want to do this. But Margaret's reputation as a vindictive socialite made her decision for her. "Miss," she said, softly turning to Linda, her eyes filled with regret, "I think it's best if you leave. We can't have any more disruptions today." Linda felt the final blow land in her chest like a stone. Her eyes widened in disbelief, tears brimming, but refusing to fall. "You're asking me to leave?" she whispered, her voice hollow, even though I've done nothing wrong. Margaret folded her arms smugly, her diamond bracelets jingling with each movement. "Exactly," she said, her words sharp as glass. "You're proving my point. Girls like you don't belong here." A trembling breath escaped Linda's lips as her gaze locked onto Margaret's steely blue eyes. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it echo inside her head. "You're only doing this," she whispered, her voice laced with wounded dignity because of the color of my skin. "You should be ashamed of yourself." Margaret recoiled as if struck, her nostrils flaring. But before she could reply, Linda straightened her shoulders, clutching her small purse against her chest. The room felt too bright, too silent, too heavy. She inhaled deeply, and with every ounce of grace left in her, turned away from Margaret's hateful glare. As she walked slowly toward the boutique's glass doors, her knees trembling beneath her, the other customers parted like the Red Sea, their eyes downcast in shame or curiosity. Every step felt like dragging chains, but Linda kept her chin high. Because no matter how shattered her heart felt, she refused to let Margaret see her break. Outside the boutique, the summer sun felt cruelly bright on her tear-streaked face. But deep within a small ember of defiance burned hotter with each step she took away from Margaret's poison. Because this wasn't the end. Not today. Not ever. Margaret had declared war on the wrong girl, and soon she would learn that truth in a way she could never have imagined. The summer heat pressed against Linda's skin as she stepped out of Bella's boutique, her eyes adjusting to the bright midday sun. The hum of passing cars and distant laughter felt like a cruel contrast to the turmoil raging inside her chest. She walked a few paces away from the glass storefront before stopping on the sidewalk, her breath coming in shallow waves. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her purse, fumbling for her phone. For a moment, she just stared at the screen, seeing her father's name glowing back at her. Her thumb hovered above the call button as tears blurred her vision. She blinked them away with fierce determination. This wasn't a moment for tears. This was a moment for truth. With one final inhale, she pressed the button and raised the phone to her ear. The line rang once, twice, before a calm, warm voice answered. "Hey, sweetheart," her father said, his baritone wrapping around her like a protective embrace even through the phone. "How's the shopping going?" Linda swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "Dad, can you come to the boutique?" She said, her words quivering despite her effort to sound calm. There's a situation here." There was a beat of silence. When her father spoke again, his voice carried an undercurrent of quiet steel. "He'll be there in 10 minutes. Inside the boutique, Margaret was still holding court by the perfume counter, regaling another shopper with her version of events. "I'm telling you, dear, these people come in here just to cause trouble," she said, her voice dripping with smug certainty. "If they spent half as much time working as they do loitering, maybe they'd be able to afford something." Sarah, the manager, hovered nearby. Her nerves frayed, wishing desperately that this day would end. As she reached up to adjust a misplaced scarf on a mannequin, the glass doors swung open with a quiet chime. The sudden hush that fell across the boutique felt almost physical, pressing down on everyone like a thick fog. A tall man entered, his footsteps measured and confident. His tailored navy suit framed his broad shoulders perfectly, and his polished leather shoes clicked with purpose against the marble floor. But it wasn't his clothes or his commanding posture that drew every eye to him. It was his presence, calm yet undeniably powerful, like a silent storm rolling in from the sea. Margaret's eyes flicked up with annoyance at first, but her expression shifted instantly as she took in his stature and the dark intensity in his gaze. Behind him, a second figure stepped inside, a bodyguard in a sharp black suit with an earpiece scanning the boutique with professional vigilance. The customers began whispering among themselves, their curiosity quickly morphing into hushed awe. "Mr. Carson," Sarah stammered, stepping forward, her voice trembling. We weren't expecting you today." Mark Carson didn't respond immediately. Instead, his sharp brown eyes scanned the boutique until they landed on Linda, standing near the entrance, with her head bowed and her arms wrapped around her small purse. The sight of his daughter's trembling shoulders caused a muscle in his jaw to tighten. He turned to Sarah, his voice calm, but edged with a force that made her flinch. "What happened here?" he asked, his words slicing through the heavy silence like a blade through silk. Before Sarah could gather an answer, Margaret stepped forward with a confident smile, assuming control of the moment. "Oh, I'm so glad someone responsible is here," she began, her tone thick with fake sweetness. "This girl was causing quite a disruption. She was acting suspicious, and I was only trying to protect the store's reputation." Mark's eyes shifted slowly to Margaret, studying her with a chilling stillness. His next words came low and deliberate. "Is that so?" he asked, his gaze steady and unreadable. But beneath his calm exterior, an earthquake of rage was building, one that Margaret Pierce was about to unleash upon herself with every smug syllable she uttered next. Margaret straightened her pearl necklace with an air of victory, oblivious to the undercurrent of danger gathering in Mark Carson's gaze. "Yes, Mr. Carson," she said, her voice ringing confidently across the boutique. She was loitering, touching expensive gowns she obviously can't afford. And when I asked the staff to check her bag, she got defensive. "Girls like her, they just come here to make a scene." Mark's expression didn't change, but the room felt colder, as though the air itself had stiffened in response to her words. His eyes flickered briefly to Sarah, who stood rooted beside the perfume display, her cheeks pale with shame. "Is this true?" he asked quietly, his voice calm, yet carrying a gravity that made Sarah swallow hard before answering. "Mrs. Pierce raised concerns," Sarah said hesitantly. "But we searched Linda's bag. She didn't take anything." I didn't know she was your daughter, sir." At that, Margaret let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Daughter," she repeated, her blue eyes widening with disbelief. Your daughter." She scoffed and folded her arms tightly. "Well, I suppose you let anyone in your family shop here these days?" The silence that followed was electric. The customers who had gathered near the accessory racks froze in place, their eyes wide with shock. Linda's chest constricted painfully at Margaret's words, but she forced herself to stand taller, clutching her purse tighter against her chest. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Mark took a slow step forward, until he was standing directly in front of Margaret. He wasn't a physically imposing man in the traditional sense, but his aura of authority, sharpened by righteous fury, made him tower over her. He tilted his head slightly, studying her, with eyes that seemed to look straight through her polished exterior to the decaying prejudice beneath. "This girl you're accusing," he said softly, his voice trembling not with fear but with tightly leashed rage, "is my daughter. Her name is Linda Carson, and she has every right to be here." A collective gasp rippled through the boutique. Margaret's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The staff stared at Mark with newfound understanding, while other shoppers exchanged murmured remarks, shaking their heads at Margaret's humiliation. Linda felt her knees weaken with relief, her father's words wrapping around her like an unbreakable shield. She looked up at him, her vision blurred with tears, seeing his jaw clenched tight with protective fury. Margaret swallowed hard, forcing herself to regain her composure. She tried to laugh again, but the sound came out brittle and weak. "Well, how was I supposed to know?" she said quickly, her eyes darting around, searching for support among the silent crowd. "She didn't say who she was. Besides, I was just looking out for the store's reputation." Mark's eyes narrowed, dark and unblinking. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with dignity," he said, each word enunciated with quiet force. His gaze swept over the boutique, lingering on Sarah and the other staff. "That goes for all of you." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but the sharp shake of Mark's head silenced her. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a slammed iron gate. Then he turned to Linda, his eyes softening as they met hers. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Linda nodded, her lips quivering with a trembling smile. "I am now," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. But this was far from over, because as Margaret stood there stripped of her false superiority, Mark Carson was only just beginning to reveal the consequences of her prejudice and the lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Margaret's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes darted desperately around the boutique, searching for support among the silent customers who only moments before had treated her with polite deference. Now their gazes were cold and judgmental, their whispers filled with scorn. Mark Carson turned away from her, dismissing her with a flick of his eyes, as he focused his attention on Sarah, the store manager, who stood trembling near the accessories counter. "Sarah," he said, his voice calm yet layered with steel, "I want you to understand something very clearly. This store bears my name. My family owns this chain. I built it with the promise that every customer, no matter their background, age, race, or wealth, would be treated with respect. Today you've allowed this woman's prejudice to dictate your actions." Sarah's face crumpled with shame, tears filling her eyes as she lowered her head. "Mr. Carson," she whispered, her voice cracking. "So sorry. I didn't recognize her. I was just trying to keep the peace." Mark's expression darkened with quiet disappointment. You don't keep the peace by sacrificing dignity, he replied, each syllable measured and firm. You protect it by standing up for what's right. If you can't understand that perhaps you're in the wrong profession. The room fell silent again, broken only by Margaret's nervous shuffling. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure, her false bravado slipping back into place like cracked porcelain. Mr. Carson, she began, her voice trembling as she forced a small laugh. I was only trying to protect your store's reputation. Surely you understand. We can't just let anyone come in, and anyone. Mark cut in sharply, his voice low yet echoing across the boutique, like distant thunder. He took a step toward her, his presence so commanding that Margaret instinctively flinched backward. You mean my daughter, he said, his tone calm but edged with ice. What you're protecting isn't my store's reputation. It's your own comfort in a world where you believe people like her don't belong. Margaret's mouth fell open again, her cheeks flushing crimson as a cold sweat broke across her forehead. That's not what I meant, she stammered, her voice breaking under the weight of his gaze. I didn't know she was your daughter. She shouldn't have to be, Mark said, his eyes locked on hers, unblinking and fierce. No one should have to prove their worth to you. Respect is not a privilege you grant. It's a basic human right. Behind them, customers nodded silently, their eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and admiration. Some discreetly lifted their phones, recording the confrontation that felt like justice unfolding in real time. Linda stood rooted beside the perfume display, tears streaming down her cheeks, not from pain, but from the overwhelming power of her father's words. In that moment, she felt the deep, unbreakable certainty of belonging not just in this boutique, but in every space she chose to walk into for the rest of her life. Mark turned back to Sarah and spoke with a finality that left no room for argument. I want her banned from every boutique we own. Permanently. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried the force of a gavel striking down in judgment. Margaret gasped, her eyes widening in horror. What? You can't do that. I spend thousands here every month. I'm a valued client. Mark's gaze softened with pity, though his words remained as sharp as shattered glass. No, Mrs. Pierce, he said softly, his eyes locked on hers. You were a valued client. Today you showed us exactly who you are, and we don't serve people like that. The boutique remained silent as Margaret stood frozen, her eyes darting around in desperate humiliation. But there was no sympathy left for her there. Only silence and the quiet sound of her own arrogance crumbling around her. Margaret's chest heaved as her eyes darted frantically across the boutique, searching for an ally among the shoppers, but none met her gaze. Their silent disapproval pressed down on her like a crushing weight. Her lips trembled as she forced out a brittle laugh, desperate to reclaim her dignity. Mr. Carson, she said, her voice trembling. Surely we can resolve this quietly. I've been shopping here for years. Think of your brand, your reputation. This isn't necessary. Mark turned to face her fully. For a moment he simply watched her, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. Then he shook his head slowly, his voice calm, yet layered with disappointment. My brand, he said softly, is built on respect and integrity. Today, you showed everyone here that neither of those values matter to you. I will not allow someone who carries such poison in their heart to stain what I've built. Margaret's breath hitched, and her eyes widened as tears of frustration welled up. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. You don't understand. I was only trying to what Mark interjected, his words cutting through her excuses like a cold blade. To remind my daughter of where you think she belongs, to humiliate her for daring to walk into a store her family owns. You saw a young black girl and assumed she was a threat. You tried to strip her of dignity she never owed you in the first place. A stunned silence fell across the boutique, broken only by the quiet sobs escaping from Linda's trembling lips. She felt her knees grow weak, but her father's unwavering presence beside her anchored her to the ground like deep roots in a storm. Mark reached out and gently placed a strong, reassuring hand on her shoulder. She felt the warmth of his touch spread through her chest, melting away the icy humiliation that had coiled there only moments before. Margaret's tears spilled over now, streaking down her perfectly powdered cheeks as her mascara smudged under the harsh boutique lighting. "You can't do this to me," she pleaded, her voice raw. "Think of what people will say." Mark tilted his head slightly, regarding her with a pity so profound it cut deeper than any anger ever could. "People will say the truth," he replied softly, "that you let your prejudice define your actions, and that today it defined your fate." He turned to Sarah, who stood pale and trembling behind the counter. "Have security escort Mrs. Pierce out," he instructed, his tone final, "and inform corporate that she is permanently banned from all Carson boutiques, effective immediately." Sarah nodded wordlessly, her eyes downcast with shame. As two uniformed security guards approached from the store entrance, Margaret let out a strangled sob. "Please," she whispered one last time, but neither Mark nor Linda looked at her again. The guards flanked her on either side, their grips firm but respectful as they guided her trembling form toward the exit. The sound of her designer heels clicking against the marble floor was no longer a mark of status, but of defeat. As she reached the glass doors, she paused and turned back, her face twisted in humiliation and disbelief. But Mark's arm was wrapped protectively around Linda's shoulders, and his gaze was fixed on his daughter with fierce, unbreakable love. In that moment, Margaret realized the truth that burned deeper than her banishment. Her money, her pearls, her designer clothes, none of it mattered. Because dignity wasn't something you could buy. It was something you carried within you, and she had none left to carry. As the glass doors closed behind Margaret, silence settled over the boutique, like the quiet after a storm. Linda turned to her father, tears still glistening in her eyes, but now they were tears of relief and quiet triumph. Mark gently cupped her face in his strong hands and smiled, his eyes softening with pride. "You handled yourself with grace today, sweetheart," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel unworthy. You belong wherever you choose to stand." Linda nodded, her chest swelling with a newfound strength that pulsed through her veins like warm light. Around them, customers and staff watched in silent reverence, the lesson settling deep in their hearts. Respect is not something granted by wealth, status, or age. It is a basic dignity every person deserves. Prejudice only reveals the darkness within the one who judges, never the worth of the person judged. As Mark placed his arm protectively around Linda's shoulders, leading her to the checkout to buy her dress, she walked taller than she ever had before. Because dignity once reclaimed becomes an unbreakable shield. Never let others' ignorance define your worth. Stand firm in your truth and treat everyone with respect, for that is the truest sign of strength. If this story inspired you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to hear more powerful stories of dignity, courage, and justice that remind us all of what truly matters.